We're going to get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar, Bringing the Year to a Joyful Close. My name is Jane Kofi. I am coming to you from my home in Virginia. I live a little bit just outside of Richmond. I am the Director of Curriculum and Instruction in the Programs Department for Responsive Classroom. But prior to joining the Center for Responsive Schools full-time, I was a classroom teacher, did 2 years at a private school, pre-K through 2nd grade, and then I also did 18 years at a public school, 1st grade through 5th grade. And I am joined this evening with my colleague and friend, Dr. Joe Tilley.
Thanks, Jane. I'm Joe Tilley. I'm excited to be here, and I just got even more excited because as Jane was introducing herself, I was still paying attention to the chat and noticed that we've got somebody representing Nashville tonight, which is where I'm coming to you from. And so I want to say welcome and how excited I am to be here with Jane to host this with you. I work as well in the programs department with Jane. I am the manager of research for the programs department. Prior to this role, I was a curriculum and instructional designer with the programs department. And then before coming to CRS full-time, I was a classroom teacher teaching special education, K to 8, a little bit of everything in between, self-contained, pull-out, resource, inclusion, co-teaching, everything in between. And so I'm definitely excited to be here tonight. I always get a little bit selfishly excited, if I can be very honest, when I get to work with Jane, because I learned so much from her. And so I'm excited to be here with you tonight. I'm going to kick it back over to Jane. She's going to talk to you a little bit about the format, and then we're going to get started with the content.
Thanks, Joe. And the feeling's mutual, obviously. So for those of you who may be joining one of our webinars for the first time, I just want to let you know a little bit about the way the webinar is set up, and maybe you're familiar or maybe you're not, but then we can all be on the same page. So you in this particular webinar format can see me and you can see Joe, but you cannot see any of the other attendees. You'll probably also notice that you don't have the features to be able to turn on and off your audio or turn on and off your camera, because those features don't exist in this particular format. So what it will look like is you can see me and Joe sharing this content with you. You won't be able to see the other attendees, but that's okay. The way that we'll be able to communicate is through the chat box feature. And so you'll be able to share your thoughts and ideas through there. And the way that we've structured our time together this evening is to allow for it to be interactive. We're going to ask you some questions and allow you to respond to those questions using the chat feature. And also there's going to be times where you might actually have a question. You're wondering something that we shared or something you want to know a little bit more about. In that case, it's a really great idea to use the Q&A feature. You'll see the Q&A feature your toolbar, probably somewhere near the chat feature, and that will send a question directly to Joe or me. So if I'm sharing content, Joe will be able to answer that question for you using the Q&A feature. And if Joe is sharing content, then I'll be able to do the same thing and answer that question using the Q&A feature. The other thing that we're going to be able to do with you this evening is we've got some resources that we want to share. And so there are going to be some times where we'll share resources to individuals using the chat feature and also using the Q&A feature. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go throughout our time together this evening. And so just a little bit about what it looks like. But as always, if there's something that Joe shares or something that I share and you want, it resonates with you or you're connecting with it, please use the chat feature and share that with us. And if you have a specific question and you want it to not get lost in all that's happening in the chat box, be sure to use the Q&A feature to share that information with me and Joe. So as we jump into our content today, you've probably already had the opportunity to notice that we're thinking about how we end the year and making sure that we end it in a positive and joyful way. And we're really specifically going to focus on the practices of morning meeting and responsive advisory meeting. And so here are our learning goals for our time together this evening. Just take a moment and read over those goals. So as you can see, we're really going to focus on those practices of morning meeting and responsive advisory meeting, and really thinking about how we can use those two practices to help support in closing the year in a really positive way for students. And so as we go throughout our time together this evening, perhaps there's one of those goals that you're thinking about more specifically, that you're like, this is one I want to keep in the back of my mind, that I'm going to guide my time together this evening, or our time together this evening. So just think of one of those goals, maybe all three of those goals or resonate with you, and that's something you want to hold on to as we spend time speaking to and talking about morning meeting and responsive advisory meeting this evening. So as we jump into our time together, one of the first things we're going to do is pose a question for you. And so here's the question that we want you to answer. And you're going to use the chat box feature to do this. And as you're responding to this question, also read other colleagues and other educators' responses to the question of what are some academic, social, and emotional skills that morning meeting, if that's what you use, or responsive advisory meeting have helped you practice and reinforce with your students. So take a moment and think about that, and then use the chat feature to respond to this question. See, speaking and listening, absolutely. Preferences, empathy, getting to know one another, community building, active listening, community, relationships, conversations, self-control, eye contact, and turn taking. Yes. Some really strong skills that we're supporting students in reinforcing, but then also in helping them practice those. Absolutely, all of the above. Acceptance, social justice. Right, forgiveness. So many strong skills coming through. If you haven't had an opportunity to see them as they're appearing, feel free to scroll back through those to see all of those skills that other educators have said morning meeting and responsive advisory meeting have done in helping support their students in being successful. So as we jump into thinking a little bit more about morning meeting and also responsive advisory meeting, hold on to these skills, because these are going to be really important as you think about what are the ones that I really want to focus on with my students, because there's so many that we can think about that are really going to support students and closing the year in a positive way. But you know your students best, so you'll know, you know what, this is an area that I really want to focus on for my students. This is what they need as we end the year in a positive way. So in thinking about that, we're going to focus specifically first on morning meeting. So for those of you who use morning meeting, you'll know, and if you haven't, I'm just going to give you a brief overview on morning meeting. Morning meeting is a set time in the morning in which students gather, and it's a great way to set the tone for the day. It's about 20 to 30 minutes, but that can vary depending on your time and what's happening during the day. But students start the day this way. So this usually happens in the lower or primary grades, so in elementary school. So whether that's pre-K through 6th in your building, or pre-K through 5th, or K through 5th or 6th, this is the practice that usually begins the day for students. They go through 4 sequential components. So starting with greeting, the sharing, the group activity component, and then ending with a message. However, the message is usually what students see when they first come into the classroom, and it sets them up for the learning for the day, but also for morning meeting. And with morning meeting being the way that the day starts, it's also, when we think about it, there's specific goals that morning meeting is set to accomplish. And so here are the goals for morning meeting. I'm going to speak a little bit about some of them, but really I want to give you a moment to read over them first. So take a moment and read over the goals of morning meeting. In the chat, so many people spoke about all of the different skills, academic, social, and emotional skills that morning meeting helps to support, but also reinforce and allow students to practice, and then also implement some of those skills that you know that students still need. And morning meeting allows for us to be really purposeful in thinking about what is it that my students need, especially when we start the year. So if this is how we start the year, and this is how we start every day, then we want to make sure that we're also doing the same thing as we close the year. And that can sometimes feel challenging, because it's been a long year. There's been many things that have occurred throughout the year that make it a little bit challenging to feel that same type of positivity sometimes and that same kind of joy sometimes, especially when the year comes to a close. And maybe for some of us, we're thinking in the back of our heads, okay, there's only this many days of school, but we want those last few days of school to be as joyful as the days that were prior to that and the days that started the year, and using morning meeting very specifically and setting the tone, not just for the day, but to close the year is going to be super important as we think about what we want to do with our students and how we want to end the year so that students feel that joy when they end the year. Even though they may be excited to get the summer started, there are also some students who are like a little bit anxious or nervous to get the summer started. And so we want to make sure that their few lasting memories with us as we wrap up the year are positive ones. We're going to speak more about specifically what to focus on, and then also some tips and some ideas about morning meeting as we go throughout our time together this evening. But before we do, it's really important, like I said, the way that we structured this webinar was for us to be able to gain some ideas from one another. And so I'm going to pose this question for us, and you're going to use the chat feature just as you did before to respond to this question. And this is one of those questions where we've got something that we want to be able to give away, a resource that's going to help support you when you think about morning meeting, and that's the 99 Activities and Greetings book. And so what we'll do is give you the opportunity to respond to this question. What is one of your favorite morning meeting greetings or activities? And if you'll take a moment and put that in the chat, and then we'll select someone to be able to receive this resource. So take a moment, think about that, and put that in the chat. Then other people will have some ideas to share too. Lots of great ones. Oh, so many really strong ones that students really love. And some that I haven't heard of. Oh, I know, shoe salad. Lots of mix and mingles. Those ones are fun too. I don't know the rocket greeting either. Hopefully you're taking a moment to look at these and see these ones that are coming through in the chat so that you have some other ideas to work from, but then also some greetings and activities if you haven't tried them, being able to look those up so you can get some additional ideas for your morning meetings too. Give you a few more minutes to add to the chat. All right. I think we've got everyone in. Few minutes. So polling one. Angela Alston, I think you put more than one in. You had lots of ideas. Angela Alston, this evening you're going to receive the 99 Activities and Greetings resource. So if you would please, in the Q&A box, if you'll put in your first and last name, Angela, and then also your mailing address, and it will allow us to send you the 99 Greetings and Activities resource. So don't worry, there'll be more things that we're sharing with others, but we're going to spend some time thinking about responsive advisory meeting.
Thank you, Jane. I just want to make you aware, just so you know, I'm having some connection issues here. So if I freeze, you'll know that's what it was. So I apologize in advance. Jane, thank you so much for what you've kind of set up here, because I think it's really important for us as we're talking about like ending the year, reminding ourselves of what it is that we're doing some of these things for. And I love the fact that Jane started out by talking about what morning meeting is and what the goals are and those types of things, because it really is important for us to remember that even though we're closing down a school year, it's still important for us to recall those things. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the advisory meeting, the responsive advisory meeting, which is the somewhat the parallel structure for the middle school model for responsive classroom. I told you earlier that I was a special education teacher. And one of the things that I absolutely love about the advisory meeting is that it's a great equalizer. And when we think about living in a time in which we are focused on making sure that we create equity for all students, the advisory meeting is that time. I worked with students who oftentimes would go to content-based classes, and they would find themselves slightly behind simply because they didn't have the background knowledge, or they hadn't completed the prerequisite skills that were needed in order to get where they needed to for the next one. And so that advisory meeting is that such a unique opportunity for all students to participate, and to do so in a way where they feel like they are completely part of something. And I want you to think about how powerful that is for students to end a school year being a part of an advisory meeting in which they feel like they are completely successful. Think about how much straighter their backs are and how much pride they're going to walk away with because of that. And that's the coolest part about advisory meeting. And so I want to remind us a little bit about what the goals of the responsive advisory meeting are. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the purposes, and then we'll talk about how to connect that to ending the year on a strong note. So we know that the goal of this time together with our students is to have that frequent and meaningful opportunity to meet with a caring adult. Now, by the end of the school year, getting toward the end of the school year, it is somewhat assumed, I guess is the easiest way to say this, it is somewhat assumed that that relationship has started to be built, and that foundation for that relationship has gotten strong. But this time coming to the end of the school year is still really important to protect for students to have that chance. And I guess I want to pause for just a second and take a side street. And Jane knows me well enough to know that I do tend to take some side streets. So I'm going to take liberty and take one here and just simply say it this way. Students still, even though it's the end of the year, they still have worries, they still have anxieties, they still have those things that they're going through. And even though there's all of these positives that we can point to for our students, they are still dealing with these stresses and anxieties of everything from life in general to the fact that some students don't necessarily want to leave the grade that they're in because they've become attached to what they're doing and who they're doing it with. If my mom were here, she would share with you the story of when I was in fourth grade and my grades suddenly took a horrible turn toward the end of the school year, and we had this meeting with my teacher, and the teacher turned to me with my mom sitting there and said, "What's going on? Why is everything getting so bad?" And I said, "Well, if I fail, then you have to teach me again next year." And she kind of laughed and she said, "No, if I fail, they're not going to put you with me next year." And I say that to say, like, that was the way I was thinking toward the end of the school year. And so when we're closing down the school year, we're not necessarily talking just about activities. We're not just talking about these things that we're doing with students. We're also talking about the idea around helping them to close down their sixth grade time, their seventh grade time, their third grade time, and closing that down to prepare them for that next step. And so when we talk about this opportunity to meet with a caring adult, this is sometimes the conversation that will come up even naturally. They'll start talking about that. We want them to be able to have that time to develop positive relationship with their peers. The advisory meeting is such an opportunity to have discussions about things that you can't always take content time away from to discuss. These are maybe skills that students have that don't always get highlighted when they're in school. These may be activities, hobbies, or experiences that they want to share and develop bonds with other individuals with. And so this is that opportunity for them to do that in a positive way with their peers. And then lastly, the idea around having this opportunity to further develop academic, social, and emotional competencies. We all know, and you all are in the classroom, and Jane and I are not that far removed from the classroom, that we remember just how hard it is to balance trying to teach a standard while also trying to teach students how to work in pairs and how to work in groups and how to get along or how to deal with it when you don't necessarily get along with somebody. And so this is that opportunity to have some of those really powerful conversations where students don't feel so stressed in the moment, because even for a student, it can be challenging to talk about, how do I deal with this kid that's sitting next to me that I don't get along with, while also trying to learn long division. And so, giving them those opportunities to be able to have those conversations in that low risk environment, and having some of those really high interest type conversations. And so it's important to be goal driven, even toward the end of the year. So when you're thinking about structuring your advisory meetings, your conversations, your opportunities, your activities, then you have to think through, like, how is it meeting one or all of these types of goals? And so that leads me to what we know to be the purposes around advisory meeting. We know these 7 purposes, and I'm going to give you a moment to read through those just to familiarize yourself with them. These purposes don't always live completely by themselves, meaning that building student to student affiliation oftentimes occurs within all the other 6. It just may not be the sole focus. And I think that that's the thing that I want to point out when it comes to these purposes, because it's really important to recognize that you still, even though you're getting at the end of the year, you still want there to be a good purpose behind this. Oftentimes, these are good opportunities to do energizing and re-engaging type of activities, because students are, they're past state testing. They're getting to that point where they're starting to feel it. It's getting springtime. Or if you live here in Nashville, we went straight from winter to summer. But it starts to get kids to get excited about the fact that they know that summer's coming. They know that break is coming. And so their behavior, they start to get energetic in those types of things. And this is that opportunity to harness that in a positive way. The other really good one is this reflection and recalibration, or recalibrate type moment. This is really cool because you're at the end of the year now, and you can have some conversations about things that occurred previously in the year that maybe is still out there to talk about. For example, we had a conversation at the end of the school year when I was still in the classroom during an advisory meeting. We had a conversation in regards to an incident that occurred in the cafeteria months before that. And the students had this really intense conversation about how to avoid it. It wasn't like a negative intensity, but it was just like they were really engaged in it. They were really thinking through, like, and I remember one of them said, hey, we're about to be 7th graders and we can't keep doing these kind of things. Like we've got to get out of this habit of doing these kind of just, it wasn't anything bad. It was just kind of, typical teenage cafeteria behavior when we forgot to put a person at the door to be watching them the entire time. So, but the purposes here are really important, because you also want to make sure that you are still including all students. And this is something that I can remember when I was in 7th grade, and at the end of the year, the teacher went around the room and said something positive about every single student to us. We didn't get awards, we didn't get recognition. He just said something positive that he enjoyed about us. And that has stuck with me through all of the years because it was so inclusive. He included every single person. It wasn't the most popular award goes to, or the most athletic goes to, or those kind of things. And I can also remember being in classrooms where those were the end of the year type things. And so these are just really important to think through, not only just the purposes, but making sure that you're using one of the purposes to include everybody. The last thing that I'll say about both the goal and the purposes here, it's important to recall that this time is still a structured time, but it can be one of those structures where, especially middle school students, they can start to guide the process. So if there's something that they want to talk about, if there's something that they're wanting to do, hear them out on that. And so, I just wanted to throw that in. So let's have a little fun. Let's give away something. In the chat box, if you would share one of your favorite acknowledgement activities. For those of you that are not familiar with what an acknowledgement is, An acknowledgement is when we allow students to go up to other students, introduce themselves, and then answer a question. And so that might sound something like this. Good morning, Jane. Today my energy level is on a 10 and I'm excited to be here. And then she would respond by saying, good morning, Joe. My energy level is on a 1 and I need a 5-hour energy to get me through this activity. So that's an acknowledgement. And so that's one of the things that we do in the middle school structure. So just drop that in the chat box. Even if it's not an acknowledgement activity, if you've got an activity that you do with students where they're introducing themselves to one another, go ahead and drop that in the chat box. Partner introductions, absolutely. Turn and talk. Oh, one of my favorites. Warm wind blows. Yeah. All right, Jane, you are the giveaway. Unmute yourself. Oh, what's the news? Yep, love what's the news.
Got to give it time till, enough of those come through.
Absolutely, yeah.
Get a few more. And if you haven't had the opportunity to see some of those, be sure to scroll through and see what other educators are sharing about acknowledgement. So you have, others to take a look at and work from.
And while Jane is deciding who is going to receive this incredible resource, I just want to take a moment and tell you about the Responsive Advisory Meeting book. For those of you that are working with middle schoolers, this book is an absolute fantastic resource. Gives you 150 advisories for the year, and they are purpose-based. And so it'll walk you through all the components, things like that. So it's a fantastic resource if you don't already have it. And so with that,
So it looks
Jane?
like it's Deanna Monroe.
Deanna Monroe.
So Deanna, you will receive this resource, and if you will share with us in the Q&A feature your name and your mailing address, we'll be able to get that resource to you.
Fantastic. So we're going to keep talking a little bit about how to set the stage to end the year off on this really positive, upbeat, and strong note. And in particular, using morning meeting and responsive advisory meeting. The first and foremost piece that Jane and I can share with you is keeping the goal and purpose right at the forefront of your mind. It is so important to think through what is my goal here and what is my purpose here. If it's a morning meeting in which you are trying to celebrate, then you have to think about celebrations that are inclusive of all students. Absolutely, yes. So the planning process, that's what I was trying to get to. There's some things that you want to consider through this, right? And so first and foremost, thinking in terms of what that focus is. And it doesn't matter if it's morning meeting or if it's the responsive advisory meeting. You have to think through what is that focus? What is that theme that I'm going to put the spotlight on with these students and do with them? Is it going to be reflective? Am I going to ask them to think back on something? Am I going to ask them to share something? Am I going to ask them to think back in time? A couple of cautionary tales on reflection. Reflection isn't always positive for some students. And so you have to think about when you ask them to reflect back, they may reflect back on something that was not the most positive experience for them. And so you have to be prepared for that type of response. You have to be prepared for that type of conversation. The other thing about reflection is that not everybody wants to share their reflection. And so for those individuals that may be a little bit reluctant to share with others that this was my success or this was my struggle or whatever the case is, you have to think about how to still include those individuals and not make it feel like that they are just taking a pass, right? And so think through that type of piece. These activities can be celebratory, and it is celebratory is one of those really incredibly powerful, fun, enjoyable moments when we structure it and when we think about what our goal and our purpose is. We want to celebrate everybody. We want to make sure that everyone feels like that they are being celebrated, that they can see how they have grown, they can see how they are ready to end the year, ready to go to that next step, all of those types of things. But the tricky part about celebratory is making sure that we don't get to that place where we're giving out awards or we're asking students to, how am I trying to say this? The caution is in asking students to celebrate other students on the spot. So if you're going to do some of these things, think through how you may need to prepare your students ahead of time, which is the last bullet point, but in particular with this celebration piece, you want to think through. You could do both. You could also do other things. There's nothing wrong with continuing to build skills at the end of the school year. There's nothing wrong with continuing to have goals and purposes that are focused around students building affiliations with one another, students building additional skills with one another, any of those types of things. And so it is just that there's the focus is where you think it needs to go. But I do often think it's powerful and important to include students in that conversation so that they can kind of give you some stuff too. Think through what skills that you need to be reviewed or reinforced. This is really important because, again, we want to make sure that all students are included. And you can be included if the skills that are required for the activity, for the conversation, those types of things are not there. Also think through that structure piece. One of the things I often tell people is make sure that you always do at least a 3-step process, which is give them individual think time, give them a partner to think with for a moment, and then ask to come to the whole group or to the smaller groups, because that gives students an opportunity to think through what they want to say, share it, clean it up with a partner that they're comfortable with, and then come to the whole group. And so you can think through that. You can think through skills like thinking skills, reflection, like we were talking about that earlier, like the reflection piece of that's a skill. And to do it positively, you may have to work with students on that skill first to then get to that thing that you do from a reflection standpoint. So just think through what those skills are. Make sure that you are reviewing them, reinforcing them. If it's a new skill that you're teaching it, right? And so it's all of those pieces that you want to make sure, because again, we want the strongest way to end the school year is to make sure that students are feeling connected and feeling like they are a part of it. And so that's important. And then the preparations that you need in order to make sure that it's successful, you just want to think through where spacing, how much space do I need? How much time do I need? What are those skills again that I've got to go through? Just really thinking through all of those preparations. Sometimes you will have to give students kind of some pre-work, meaning that you may have to tell them on a Tuesday, hey, tomorrow we're going to come in, we're going to have this conversation. So I want you to go ahead and start thinking about this. And so that's just something that's really important to think through, because you don't want to just prepare your room. You also want to prepare your students. And so that is thinking through what reminding language do you need to use? How are you going to set these types of things up? Because again, I think that there's always the assumption that's made, and I think it's a pretty good assumption that by the end of the year, we're getting to that place where students pretty much know how things run and what is expected of them. But when you're getting into these conversations, you want to remove as much of that process barrier as you possibly can. And so in order to do that, we use that reminding language, we use that that preparation and making sure that we're reviewing those skills. And so it's thinking through that planning piece, because the planning piece is really up to us. And so with that said, I'm kick it back over to Jane.
Thanks, Joe. Before I jump into some ideas and tips for morning meeting and closing the year in a way that's going to be positive for students, I am seeing like some fantastic questions coming through. And then also I'm noticing that there are a few people with raised hands. So what I'm going to do is try to allot that time towards the end for us to be able to address some of the questions that people are asking that might be better if everyone heard the response. But then also, if you have a hand raised, we'll answer your question toward the end. But then also, if you want to put it in the Q&A, that also allows us to get to it right away. So just a few tips if you've got a question swirling around in your mind that we can be able to answer for you. So let's think about some of those ideas and some tips for closing the year with morning meeting when you're thinking about your elementary students. And the first thing is, and Joe already spoke to this so well about setting your students up for success. I'm going to say a little bit more about this because part of it also comes with recognizing that the students you started the year with, so if you started with 7-year-olds, you probably have 8-year-olds now, or mostly 8-year-olds and maybe some 9-year-olds. And so thinking about where your students are developmentally, sometimes things that they really enjoyed when they started the year, they felt comfortable doing at the start of the year. Some of those activities may need to sit a little bit differently with your students. So that means really thinking about, all right, so this is what we did. I know that my students are in this phase of their development right now. I may need to switch some things around so that this is still enjoyable and includes all students when I do this activity or this greeting or this type of share, so that all your students are involved, but all your students feel comfortable being involved. And specifically thinking about if you have students who started the year, say like you have fourth graders who are now getting ready to be fifth graders, the transition between really caring about how their teacher sees what they do changes, and it's more about how their friends perceive the things that they do. And so when you think about the activities and greetings you use, you want to be thinking about that because you want it to be a comfortable and positive situation for all your students. And so thinking about where they are developmentally. But then also when you set your students up for success, Joe spoke to this, whenever there is an activity or a greeting or sharing that's going to require your students to give some greater thought to it. There's going to be some more setup to it. It is really important to let your students know, not like in the moment and not even maybe sometimes depending on where your students are age-wise. So if you have younger learners versus your older learners, when you're going to let them know. So front loading your students. So for example, if there is an activity that you're going to have students do in which they're going to have to think about something that happened earlier in the year, a memory that occurred way back, or memories in general, it is really helpful to let students know, either using the message, which can be a really powerful tool in which you let students know, today we're going to be talking about, during sharing, one of the memories that you remember from a field trip we took. Then it lets them know and they can be prepared. But if it's something that's going to require even more thought, it doesn't hurt to let your students know at the start of the week, throughout this week, we are going to be focusing on this. And so then students can think about that and have a response, but it also allows you to connect with students who may need a little bit more think time, who are still working on language, or students who just need time to think through the thoughts they want to share. And so it allows you to front load them and make them prepared for that so that they're able to participate in the best way possible for those students. Also, a little tip when you think about your greetings or even some of your activities, if your greetings are greetings in which a student, for example, if you did something like, I don't know, we sometimes did the basketball greeting. And so in which a greeting, something like that, where a student is greeting one student, and after they've greeted that one student, they're going to find a different student to greet. It is always a helpful idea when you're setting your students up for success for inviting students to volunteer to close the greeting. And I say that because inevitably someone's going to be last. And sometimes that can create feelings of anxiety for students when it's everyone's getting picked and I haven't been picked yet, and they're the very last person. There's a different feel to it when you invite students to say, okay, so who's going to close our greeting for us today? Okay, so Jane, you're going to close our greeting for today. So Jane is going to close. She's going to be the final person that we greet at the very end. That changes the feel to the greeting rather than it being Jane's waiting and no one has selected her for the greeting until the very end. Thanks for sharing that, Deanna. Yes, making sure that that greeting allows for students to all feel that sense of belonging and allowing for that to happen. The other thing is refreshing familiar activities. And when I say refreshing, I don't necessarily mean bringing back favorite ones, which absolutely should be done. If there's ones that your students really enjoy and they really like, absolutely bring those activities back. But then also refreshing them in terms of, for example, if you're familiar with the Fidget Family, one thing I did with my fourth graders was we rewrote that particular story to include the memories of our year. And it was something we did over the week so that the next week, that became the activity we did during our morning meeting. And so it wasn't the one that's written in the book, it's ones that our class created together. And so we determined the roles and what we were going to incorporate in that particular story. The same thing with activities like right and left, or being able to create that story with your students. If you're familiar with the greeting Find Your Match, you can also do a greeting like Find Your Classmate, in which, and this is again, setting your students up for success. So one thing about your students that that a student will share that mostly everyone in the class knows, and you take all those ideas and throughout the week, it's they pull one and everyone gets a card. Now find that classmate. They're going to greet someone. So, I'm going to greet who in our class has a twin in Miss Reed's class. And so I'm going to find that person, I'm going to greet that person, but also knowing someone else is going to be greeting me too. But it's a great way for students to be able to find out a little bit more about one another and also be able to connect in that way. Even if it's just, oh, I know who this person is, you're going to be greeting this person. And that's helpful for students to be able to do. Also think about including other teachers and families. And it doesn't always have to be in person. Now that we use technology so much more frequently in the classroom, it's a great way to be able to allow for other individuals to join morning meeting, whether they are the PE teacher or whether it's the secretary in the office, allowing them to be a part of that and to enjoy the close of the year with your students. And the final one is using the sharing component in different ways. So Joe alluded to this earlier in terms of sharing about a specific student. So instead of just doing that on the spot, it might be something that you plan in advance and saying, these 5 students, we're going to do an around the circle share. And for our around the circle share, we're going to share about Joe, we're going to share about Jane, we're going to share about this person. And so in that share, you're going to share one memory you have, like one, and using the words that students would know. So whether it's kind memory with your younger learners or memory with your older learners, being able to say a memory that you remember about Joe or something that you enjoyed about Joe this year. And so that around the circle share becomes almost like a compliment circle, being able to share about that student, but front loading your students first for that. And then even things like using the snowball and saying like a memory you remember about your year that you're going to really that you really enjoyed, and having students being able to write that out and then throw that snowball in, and everyone sharing all the memories of that school year that they really enjoyed. Just taking some of those opportunities to use the components in a way that allows students to either celebrate, reflect, or just think about some of those pieces that you want your children to be thinking about to close that year in a positive way. Joe is going to speak more about some of these ideas and tips when it comes to responsive advisory meeting. And if you find that we've created questions for you, please continue to put those in the Q&A. Oh, I forgot this. How could I forget? Something else we want to give away. If you're not familiar with our quick coaching guides, it's a quick way to be able to get information that's going to really support your students and also your school community. And so this one is joyful gatherings. And so the way we're going to do this is answering this question in the chat. What are some morning meeting activities you use at the end of the school year with your students? So take a moment and think about that and then add that to the chat. Ooh, spiderweb's a fun one. Like a compliment circle. Absolutely, Jennifer. Just like me is a good one to bring back at the end of the year. Absolutely. Favorites, neighbor. Oh, so many. As people are sharing, please take a look at all of the different activities that people use towards the end of the year. Oh, me too. Give you a few more moments to put in your different activities. Oh, so many great ones. Hopefully you're jotting some of these down to be able to think through. All right. Oh, there's a few more coming through. Oh, people got more. So many. So please take these down and jot them down. There's so many great ideas. And our person who will be receiving Joyful Gatherings is Mark Hamill. So Mark, if you'll put your name and your mailing address in the Q&A, we'll be able to get Joyful Gatherings to you. All right, Joe, tell us.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about building on what Jane was talking about. Let's talk a little bit about how to leverage a responsive advisory meeting to close down the school year with our middle schoolers, right? To kind of wind down things and those types of things. There are some kind of quick tips and some ideas that we need to have in the front of our mind when we're going through this process in order to make sure that we are ending the school year on this positive note. First and foremost, stick with the components, meaning that there's these 4 steps similar to a morning meeting. I know morning meeting has its steps, and then the RAM has these 4 components. And the reason that it's important is because if we know anything about the developmental aspect of middle schoolers, it's that they don't always enjoy things when we start to change them. And so if you've been standing at that door greeting students all year long, as that welcome component says that we should be doing, then you want to continue to do that. You don't want to throw a wrench into that process. So don't sacrifice the component for the interest of time or anything like that. You want to make sure that you're sticking to those components so that students understand those types of things. It's familiar to the process, ends up being familiar, and you're removing that barrier of possibly, because what ends up happening is we take the acknowledgement out because we think, well, I'll just take that time and put it toward the activity. And then you get started on the activity. And for 5 or 6 minutes, students are in their head going, wait a minute, we didn't do an acknowledgement. And so you kind of have to think through those types of pieces. So just remember the components, make sure that you're sticking to them and staying true to those things. Secondly, know your purpose. Know what that purpose and that goal is for that meeting. Make sure that you can articulate that to your students. When you leave here today, I want you to be able to recall 3 things that you were successful at this year, or whatever the case is, but being able to know what your purpose is, being able to articulate that to your students so that they know what their purpose is. Know and articulate your role as the advisor. One of the things that I told you is that from a developmental aspect, it is not unusual for this time of the year for students to take a real heavy lead in some of these activities. And that's fine because developmentally they are at a place where they can do that. That we want to see that. But you still need to make sure that you are stating clearly what your role as the advisor is. It may just be there to keep the conversation going. It may be there to just simply moderate, but it also may be that you're doing a reflection and you say, today, my role is going to be that I'm going to lead this because I want to make sure X, Y, or Z. So it's just thinking through that and being able to articulate that. Make sure that you're using RAM as an equalizer. You do not want students to be left out of activities because they don't have a skill or they haven't been properly prepared. So make sure that at the end at the beginning, I should say, of any RAM that you have thought through what it's going to take for that to have. Utilize high interest activities. This is that opportunity to really take on activities that students will enjoy, they will be interested in, they'll have a lot of investment in, and those kind of things. And so using those high interest activities, if you want to know what the high interest activities are, ask your students. And then lastly, I've talked about this a couple of times, and now I'm going to just straight up say it. I think it's cool to release control to students at the end of the year, meaning that we do start to expect more from them. You may ask somebody, you may ask on a Tuesday, tomorrow we're going to do this. Are there 3 students that are interested in leading it? And making sure that you rotate around so that everybody gets to be included that wants to be included, and those kinds of things. And so, But I think it's important to think through how you can use your purpose to really start to release that control to students. And the reason that this is all important is because this is how you end the year on a joyful note. When we really talk about this idea of ending the year in a joyful way, it's because we're staying true to a structure that students are familiar with. We're staying true to high interest activities. We're staying true to the idea of equalizing it so that students are the ones that are participating. We're staying true to those things that we know students appreciate when we do it, because that's what helps them to feel included. That's what helps them to feel comfortable. And that's how you end on a joyful note. That's how you have strong reflections and strong celebrations. And it's the same way with morning meeting. And so these are the kind of the ideas and the tips that are associated with the RAM. And so with that, Jane's going to give away some more stuff.
All right. So with this question, what is a responsive advisory meeting topic you use at the end of the school year with your students? So thinking about your responsive advisory meetings, go ahead and add those to the chat.
Just a topic that you end that school year with. Empathy, growth mindset, favorite activity. What's exciting to you about the next step? Thankfulness, something I'm proud of, what we are proud of, gratitude. I would have liked to have been a student in a lot of you all's classes. What we accomplished as a class, accomplishments, what we did to achieve different goals this year, how far we've come. Being a friend, the one we can do. Oh, I'll come to y'all's class any time of the week.
Yeah, so many great ones.
All right, Jane, who's our lucky winner?
All right. Our lucky winner is Donna, and I don't want to mess up your last name. Ovokaitys. So Donna, if you would put your mailing address and your name into the Q&A, we'll be able to get this resource to you. Before we close for our evening, I know there's questions that people had, so I want to be able to, they disappeared. Answer those questions. And so the way that works is, or maybe there aren't any questions, unless Joe, did you already address those questions and I just missed that?
No, are you looking for the ones that are still in the question and answer box?
No, I was looking for the raised hands that I don't see anymore.
Oh, no, I didn't. I think that they came down on their own.
Okay.
We are coming to the end of our time together. So, so what's an idea that you gained today that you will use to close your school year in a joyful way? So just thinking through some of the things that Jane's talked about, some of the things I've talked about, what's an idea that you gained today? Or if there's an activity that you know, this is the activity I'm going to use, here it is. So go ahead and drop that in the chat box. Jane, I think I saw one about including families, new activities.
Yep.
Responsive advisory meeting for older kids and morning meeting for elementary. Morning meeting is elementary, responsive advisory is middle school.
Correct.
And that's from a developmental perspective. Yeah.
Yes. Hopefully you also gained ideas from one another as you were reading people's ideas in the chat. I know some people were wondering about specific activities, like how do you do that one? And you can find some of these activities in our resources as well. So if you're wondering, that's a great place to look for some of these. And I can tell that we have a lot of creative educators who come up with activities and greetings and components that work for your students.
Yeah, and Jane, if you would, I was going to say, these are some of the resources that we have available for both responsive advisory meeting and morning meeting. So there's the 150 purposeful plans for middle school. There's also a downloadable on our website that is specific to virtual for anybody that may still be working in that environment, that has some morning meetings and advisory meetings that are adjusted for that. So you can always pull that off. The morning meeting book, morning meeting ideas, so fantastic as resources. What's not listed on here that is on our site, there are some that are specific to like the science classroom and the social studies classroom. So there's even some from that perspective. But and just so you know, I think it would be a good idea for Jane and I to mention here, these were developed by classroom teachers. These meetings and plans came from teachers that are in the classroom that were developing these and got them to us. So they're practitioners, a practitioner's best friend. With that said, we are going to give you one more resource for you, and it is our contact information. So on behalf of Jane and myself, I want to say thank you so much for being here. I know it's late in the school year, it's late in the day. We appreciate your activity and your involvement and your investment today. We appreciate what you do. And I want to say thank you from that perspective. If you're interested in bringing Responsive Classroom to your school, meaning that you're interested in things like trainings or having us come out for any reason, you can reach out to either Duke, or I'm trying to combine the names now. You can reach out to Duke or Brooke, and their emails are up there. If you have questions about any of the content tonight, specifically morning meeting, reach out to Jane. If you have anything about the advisory meeting, then you would reach out to me. Or if there's something else that we could help you with, we would be so happy to work with you. But keep up the good work. We're almost at that finish line. I know everybody always says that this time of year. We're almost at the finish line. We're almost at the finish line. But we are almost at the finish line. And, Jane and I, we know that this has been a challenging year just because of the circumstances. And so kudos to all of you for what you do. We appreciate you. And if we can be of any assistance, do not hesitate ever to reach out to us.
Absolutely. Thank you and have a good evening.
Bye, everybody.